Welcome, everyone. And today we are going to be talking about important light and shadow areas, light behavior, how to build depth and volume in your drawings or paintings. Well, we're going to be focusing on watercolor today and practicing painting spheres. But in the first part of the lesson, this is going to be kind of important information on art fundamentals that is going to be handy or useful for anyone. It doesn't matter what kind of subject matter it is that you enjoy drawing or painting, what medium it is that you use. This is all art fundamentals in the beginning. So let's talk about shading. Let's talk about light behavior. Let's talk about highlights, midtones, darks, cast shadows, and all that stuff, which is essential if you want to build believable depth and form in your drawings or paintings. Okay, so the first thing that I want to share with you are two images. Let me go ahead and pop these up on screen. Okay. All right. So in order to shade something effectively, again, it doesn't matter what it is that you are using, what medium you're using, whether you draw, whether you paint, whether you use graphite, whether you use watercolor, whether you use acrylics, whatever it is, colored pencils, you need to know these things in order to shade effectively and in order to know what you're looking at when you're using reference photos or something that you have in front of you in real life, right? There are these different areas throughout objects and subject matter, right? When it comes to the light and the shadow side that you need to pay attention to so that you can render them in a more believable way and actually arrive at a three-dimensional look, okay? So here are the first things that I want to share with you when it comes to this terminology, vocabulary, whatever it is that you want to call it, okay? Here, there is this, I took a photo of an egg because an egg is a simple object, everyday object. And I always recommend that you learn these things through studying simple objects first, okay? If you don't know these things and right off the bat, you try to shade something like a face or an animal or something like that, you're going to make the learning process way harder for yourself. So this is why I present this with a simple egg. And I want you to learn all of these things. And then once you're able to shade a simple object successfully, and you know these different kind of light and shadow areas, then go ahead and try to find them in faces and more complex subject matter. And then you can go ahead and try that. But as I always say, take your learning a step at a time, or you're going to make it way more frustrating for yourself. And I am just so sad when people give up because they think that they don't have the eye, the skill, the talent to draw or paint something. But the fact of the matter is that they have skipped over essential steps and art fundamentals that they need to acquire knowledge on before jumping into that more challenging stuff. And that is why you're so frustrated, because you haven't covered this first, okay? So here it is. So seeing this egg, all right, essentially we have a light side and a shadow side, okay? In this egg, we essentially the light side are all of those planes that are facing toward the light or that the light is able to reach, okay? And the shadow side are all of the planes in the subject that are facing away from the light and the light is not able to reach, okay? And right in between the light side and the shadow side, we have what is called a terminator. Not the movie, not Arnold Schwarzenegger, though it can help to remember it like that. But that is what that separation between the light side and the shadow side is referred to as the terminator line, okay? Does this make sense? Let me see in the chat if I have any questions. Yes, Paula, yes. No worries, it happens all the time when there is this time change. Okay, so I seem to have no questions on this one. Now let's move on to the actual like individual sections that you need to learn and understand if you want to shade something successfully, okay? All right. So in the light side, we have a few different areas, and then we have the shadow side where we have other areas that are important to know and understand, okay? In the light side, we have the highlight, we have the direct light, and we have the halftone, all right? So first, let's talk about the direct light. The direct light area, or otherwise known as the central light area, you're going to hear both terms, okay? This is the area where the light is able to hit directly, okay? And it illuminates a good portion of the object or the subject, where you see a good portion of lightest values, like a larger area of lightest values. That is a direct light or central light section, okay? A lot of light is able to reach these areas, and that is why we see lighter values there, okay? Then we have the halftone areas in this light side as well, okay? The halftone is where the lighter values start turning into the darkest values, or the shadow side of the object. All right, we're going to see this gradient where the lighter values start turning softly into the darker values, okay? That is still the light side. And then we have the highlight, okay? The highlight is the very lightest point in the object or subject. And highlights, very interestingly, highlights move. Why? Because the highlight is that point where the light is hitting directly and it is getting reflected back to our eyes. It's like imagine like a triangular, almost like angle where the light source is hitting the object directly and that light is bouncing back to our eyes. And that is what the highlight is. It's that very lightest point within the object where we have that bouncing light to our eyes situation going on. And very interestingly, with the highlight is that highlights move when you move. Okay? Why? Because that light is bouncing back to our eyes. So if we move, if our head moves in relation to the object, the location of our eyes move in relation to the object. And so the highlight is going to move on the surface of the object as well if we move. Okay, it's very interesting, and I would recommend actually doing that little like scientific test or exercise with objects at home so that you can see how the light moves across the surface of the object as you move as well. Okay. Now, when it comes to the highlight, what a lot of beginners do is they go overboard with the highlights, or they make them too large, or they use too much white in the entire object and that kind of stuff. But highlights are usually pretty small. The larger, lighter value area is actually a light value and not a plain, pure white. Highlights are those smaller sections which are almost like a plain pure white, okay? And if you know watercolor and you're starting to paint with watercolor, it's the highlights that we need to protect as we're painting, because the paper is going to stand in place for those highlight areas. I'm going to show you how to do this in the spheres that we're going to be painting together today, okay? As opposed to when painting with acrylics or oils or gouache, you add those highlights until the end over the other layers. When painting with watercolor, we need to protect the highlights from the beginning because we don't use white with watercolor. It's the paper that stands in place for our highlights and helps us create those lighter values. All right. So those are the important parts in the light side of the object. Now let's talk about the shadow side of the object. We have a couple of sections there which are very important, okay? In the shadow side of the object, we have the core shadow and we have the reflected light. The core shadow is that like band that we see here in this almost like it's not right in the middle, but it's like almost like a crescent moon shape, if you will. It's the darkest part of the object. Okay. Now, why is it, and this is a beginner mistake as well, is that they don't account for reflected light. Why is it that the darkest part of the object is near the center and not at the bottom, right? Because like one would think that if the light is hitting this object, in this case, the light would be hitting this object from the upper right because the cast shadow is on the, I'm sorry, on the upper left. Sorry. The light source is hitting this object in this case from the upper left, all right? Because the cast shadow is on the lower right. The highlight is on the upper left, nearest the light source, and the cast shadow is on the lower right, all right? In situations where you have only one light source, like in this case, I was in control of this environment when I took the photo. When you only have one light source, it is much easier to tell its location versus in other situations where you have multiple light sources, or maybe you are outdoors and it's a cloudy day and the light is very diffused. It's going to be harder to tell all of these different parts. Okay. Light is a very complex thing. It varies. What you see changes depending on the intensity of the light, on the temperature of the light, on the color of the object itself, the surface qualities, on the objects around the object, because they bounce back light onto the object and they create all of these different things. So light is a very complex thing, and you're not always going to see all of these parts very easily, especially if you're drawing or painting something that is more complex, like a face or a human figure or an animal that has a lot of texture to it, or you have multiple light sources. But I want to encourage you to try to look for these things, because even if you're drawing or painting, say something like a human figure, which is probably one of the most complex things that we can draw or paint, each part of the body can be sectioned out into a simple form, and you'll see a lot of these things throughout the body. Okay. All right. So let me move on to the shadow side, where we have the core shadow and the reflected light. The core shadow, as I said, is that darkest band that you're going to notice somewhere on the object, right? Why is it darkest? Because that core shadow area, that darkest band within the object, is where the light is not able to reach, but it is also not being affected or illuminated by reflected light that is bouncing off the surface that the object is on. Okay? In that reflected light area, even though you could say that it is the section of the object most opposite or most away from the light source, it's lighter than the core shadow section, and in this case even somewhat lighter than the halftone, or almost the same value as the halftone. Why? Because light is bouncing off the surface that the egg is on, and it is bouncing back onto the egg, and that is why we see that reflected light section, which is lighter. But when it comes to the core shadow, no reflected light is able to reach the core shadow area, and that's why it's darkest. Does that make sense? And another thing that is important to remember is that in order to differentiate as you're shading, I'm going to share with you exactly how I do this when painting with watercolor in just a bit, but remember that the lightest parts in the shadow side are still darker than the darkest parts in the light side. This is a big mistake that a lot of beginners do, and why their drawings or paintings oftentimes appear flat. Okay? So let me say that again. The lightest part in the shadow side is still lighter than the darkest parts in the light side. Okay? All right, cool. So I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to help you out. And finally, we have these two important sections in the cast shadow. Oh, and by the way, I briefly mentioned this before, but the surface that the object is on and the colors and materials of the objects around the object in the environment it is in are also going to have a huge impact on what we see. Because in this case, I placed this egg on a white canvas, stretched canvas that I had laying around. And white reflects more light than a surface that is dark, like black or dark brown. Lighter materials are going to bounce back more light than darker materials. And if you have, say, reflective objects around your object that bounce back light onto it, you're going to have those situations as well when you're painting. Okay. If you had a super smooth glass bottle, which is green, right next to your object, and the light is hitting it a certain way, you could all of a sudden start seeing greens on the object itself. Or that very reflective glass material can create other lighter areas on the object that you're trying to draw. Okay? So always consider those things. It maybe if I had placed this egg on a dark, let's say black surface, I wouldn't get as much reflected light, and that section wouldn't be as light. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so having said that, let's move on to the cast shadow and occlusion shadow. Even within the cast shadow, there are often different values. It's not one single flat value. Sometimes you'll see a flat value, maybe when there is a very stark light in the environment, like in the middle of the day, if you are like walking outside, sometimes you see very stark, very dark, sharp cast shadows created by people and objects. That does happen. But a lot of the time, you're going to see a variety of dark values within the cast shadow. And this is why it happens. Okay, so we see that larger cast shadow shape because the mass of the object itself is blocking the light from hitting that part of the surface it is on. Okay. But within that cast shadow, we oftentimes see darker areas and lighter areas. Why? This is because some reflected light from the environment is able to get into some sections of the cast shadow. And in the occlusion shadow sections nearest the object itself, there is no reflected light reaching those areas. And that is why the occlusion shadow is darker than the larger cast shadow shape. Okay? So these are the important vocabulary words and terminology that, it's not that you have to memorize them. It's that you need to understand them. Because if you understand them and you stem from actual reference photos or something physical, tangible, real that you have in front of you in real life so that you can observe value changes and light and how sometimes you have stark changes between values or defined edges and other times you have soft gradients. You need to study these things in real life and understand them, because then you're going to be able to draw and paint more successfully and more easily. And also, if you're wanting to get to a point at which you're drawing or painting from imagination, now you're going to understand what it takes to make something look realistic, and you can bring this into your drawings or paintings to make them look more realistic. But if you don't know these things, you're going to be left guessing. You're not going to know like what to look at or why things are looking in that way, why you're seeing darker values, where you're seeing lighter values. And if you're trying to draw or paint entirely from imagination, you're skipping this foundational part of your learning where you are understanding fundamentals and you are building up your observation and you're stemming from real life references or things that you have in front of you in real life. Very likely you're never going to be able to achieve the level of realism that you're after. Again, even if you're just going for mid levels of realism, not necessarily hyperrealism. I do not enjoy hyperrealism. I like a painterly look, a relatively loose look. But still, understanding these things and having them in mind as I am painting, even though I am loose as I am painting, makes a huge, huge difference. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to move on to the very last kind of theoretical thing that I want you to know before moving forward. Let me have a sip of coffee and see if I have any questions. Okay, so I seem to have no questions. Last thing that I want to explain here before moving forward. So today we're going to be practicing, essentially, we're going to do a little warm up with a monochromatic shading exercise. Then we're going to move on to the analogous shading exercise, then the complementary shading exercise. And then we're going to kind of like go back and I'm going to explain how to intensify and deepen and darken values through glazing, which is also an important watercolor technique. Okay, I mostly share tutorials on watercolor, but again, art fundamentals apply to any kind of drawing or painting. Okay, all right, so these are the basic color schemes that, and you don't have to know them all as a beginner, okay? But there are these 7 important color schemes. And color schemes are essentially groups of colors that are tried and true, that look great together. They have been used by artists throughout history to create great looking paintings that lead to harmonious, well balanced results. And knowledge of color schemes allows you to make better use of color as you're painting so that you're not only able to arrive at aesthetic results, but you're also able to communicate the mood, message, idea, or story that you're wanting to communicate. Okay. So that is what they are. But essentially, when you're first getting started with painting or drawing, the most important ones for you to know, to be aware of, that to know how to use are the analogous and the complementary color schemes. Why? Because they are methods of shading as well. Because if you know these 2 color schemes, you'll know what colors to reach for when you are wanting to develop three-dimensional form in your drawings or paintings. And that is really all you need, is to know the analogous and complementary color schemes. Yes, I'm going to talk about how to use neutrals like browns, grays, and stuff like that. Yes, it is a viable, effective way of shading as well. But it is important for you to know the analogous and complementary schemes because they will give you more tools for you to choose from whenever it is that you're wanting to develop form and kind of a really striking look, okay, with actual color and not just a black or a gray, which is what we tend to reach for when we're just getting started, okay? There are situations where it is best to use a neutral though, and I will talk about that a little bit later. And with neutral, I mean browns, grays, a white would be a neutral color as well. But again, we don't use white when painting with watercolor. Okay. So don't get me wrong. There are certain situations where I do bring in a burnt sienna, a burnt umber, browns, and even grays to deepen and darken my colors. But it is essential that you know the analogous and complementary as well. Otherwise, you're not really going to ever push past that beginner level where you're always reaching for a black or a brown, okay? And finally, there's the monochromatic where you're using one single color to develop a nice range of values for that sense of 3D form. And when painting with watercolor, you can definitely use one single color in different consistencies to develop darker areas and midtones and lightest lights by simply adding more or less water into the mixture, by using your paint in a thicker consistency versus a more watered down consistency. Thicker consistency is going to cover up more paper and it's going to lead to a darker value. And a thinner, more watered down consistency is going to leave more white paper shining through, which is going to lead to a lighter value. Okay. However, when you're using, say, a yellow or a very light color, yellow is the lightest color. So you're only going to be able to get so dark. So even if you do use your yellow in a very, very thick consistency, you're not going to really be able to get it to a very dark level to really create a sense of form. To create a sense of form, you need very dark areas, a nice range of midtones and very light areas. And if you just use a yellow, it's going to stay within the lighter midtones, okay? Um, so there's that. If you're using a dark blue, say an indigo or something like that, then you're going to be able to create a much wider range of values because you're starting with a very dark paint color. And so you add more, there's my chicken if you can hear it. If you add more water into the indigo, you're gonna make it lighter, and you add more and more, and you make it lighter and lighter. You get this huge range of blue values, right? So many times you're gonna need to bring in another color to darken and to create those darker values that you need for realism. You cannot just use one single color and think that you're going to arrive at believable results. It's a great exercise. I have videos on my channel where I'm talking about how to develop water control and an understanding of consistencies when working with watercolor by using one single color. Absolutely, that is a great exercise, and in my opinion, a must do exercise for beginners, because it is how you develop your understanding of watercolor and consistencies on water and brush control. However, when you're actually working on a full painting, very rarely are you going to use one single color for any given area. You need to understand what colors to bring in. Okay? And later on, we can have other classes where I explain the other color schemes, but since this class is on shading specifically, I want to keep it focused, and monochromatic, analogous, and complementary are the ones that you should be aware of. Okay? All right, so I'm going to remove this. Let me see if I have any questions in the chat, and I'm going to move on to explaining the supplies that I have here with me so that you can be prepared for our exercises. Hope that all of that made sense. It's a lot that I just kind of explained, but if you have any questions, that's what I'm here for. I'd be happy to help you out. Okay. So let me explain about these supplies. I actually need to go get some water. I didn't prepare my water. Okay. I'm going to be using a couple of sheets from Bao Hong. This is cold press watercolor paper, and it's 140 pounds or 300 GSM in thickness or in weight. I enjoy using cold press. It's what I use most of the time, though when I am doing line and wash, I prefer a smoother surface. So sometimes I do use hot press, or sorry, that made a lot of noise. Sometimes I do use hot press, or certain brands like Strathmore's Ready Cut Sheets. Their cold press ones are very kind of smoother than, for example, this cold press or cold press from Arches. So it does vary from brand to brand. All right. So this is what I'm going to be using for my paper. When it comes to my paint, I'm going to be using this watercolor set that I have, which includes a mixture of paint from Daniel Smith and Winsor & Newton's professional watercolor paint. You don't have to have any specific colors on hand for these exercises. You can use whichever colors you'd like, as long as you're using analogous colors or complementary colors. No worries. I'll be explaining that in just a bit. But make sure that you do have a full watercolor set, or a nice variety of like primaries and secondaries, so that you have colors to choose from for each exercise. Okay. For my brushes, I am going to be using mostly just one single brush. This is a size 14 synthetic brush that I have had for years. And I think when I bought it, it was like $4. You can see how beat up it is, and still works great. It's from Royal and Langnickel's Zen watercolor line. I can't remember if I got it through Michael's or through Blick.com. But more and more, they're carrying this line on Amazon as well. And I have these two on hand as well, but I don't think I'm going to use them. Maybe this scrubber brush. I don't think I'm going to be using this one. This is a size 8 from the size already got erased here from the use, but this is a size 8 from Cotman's 111 watercolor line from Winsor & Newton. And this is also from the same Zen watercolor brand. This is the scrubber brush, and it is a size 8 scrubber brush. It has very stiff bristles. And for a very long time, I didn't have a scrubber brush. I just did my scrubbing with a regular round brush, and it worked perfectly fine. And to be honest, sometimes these bristles are a little bit too tough, too hard for my liking. So you can just use any, say, a size 8 round brush for scrubbing if you want to do that later. I'm going to explain why I'm bringing in this technique later. Okay. And finally, for my sketching supplies, I did send out a template which you can trace over so that you can have your perfect circles for your spheres. If you want to grab that, that is available via the free Patreon link that I am leaving there in the chat. Or you probably already downloaded it if you're a Patreon member, because I sent that out yesterday. But if you have a circular object, like say this candle, you can just trace around that so that you can have your perfect circles for your spheres. And it's important that your circles are relatively perfect looking because we are painting spheres. And that is the only reason why I'm not doing this freehand. Okay. But I will say that it's important that your circles are a good size, because if they're not a good size, if your circles are too small, you're not going to be able to practice your water and brush control very well. So just as an FYI, the diameter of the circles that I'm going to be creating is 3 inches across. Okay. So the circles that you're going to see me work in would fit in a 3 by 3 inch square. All right. If you do anything smaller than that, you're not really going to get in the practice that you could be getting in. Okay. And the other watercolor supplies are the usual. I have my Blue Scott absorbent towels. This is the type of absorbent towel that I like using when painting with watercolor. I don't really enjoy using the thicker, very textured ones because I do go in and do blotting. And when my towel is heavily textured, sometimes I'm left with texture in my painting. And I don't like that. Okay. And I do have to grab my water in just a bit. But first, let me go ahead and remove myself from the stream so that we can do this together if you haven't done this. So I am just going to take my HB pencil. I do have a soft graphite eraser on hand as well. Always do. And for these exercises, I am going to decide from the beginning that the light is going to be coming from the upper left. Why do I need to kind of come to a conclusion as to where the light is coming from the beginning? Because I want to leave some space over here for my shadow, okay? For my cast shadow section, right? And I like drawing lightly because I'm turning on my light here. It is important to draw lightly when you're painting with watercolor because otherwise you're going to see the pencil work through the paint. But that is what I'm going to be doing. And since the light is coming from the upper left, my highlight is going to be somewhere in the upper left, okay? And the cast shadow is opposite to the light source on the lower right, right? Now, I will say it is very important that the circle that you create for your highlight is light, very, very light, because this entire area is going to be the lightest in your painting. And so you're going to be using very watered down paint right there. And so if you're going to see your pencil work through that very light color, okay? So make sure that this circle especially is very, very light. And I will also say that if you were here in the beginning when I was explaining about different light sections and what the highlight is, usually when painting with watercolor, I like creating a larger highlight when I am mapping things out in my sketch. Why? Because as I am painting, I'm going to soften the edge and the watercolor is going to move in and I'm going to end up with a smaller highlight. Okay. So don't think that my highlight is going to be this size at the end. It won't be. But in the beginning, I like mapping out a larger highlight than what I actually need. Because when I'm placing my color, you're going to notice in a little bit when I explain my process. As I am placing my color, I need to be mindful of this area that I need to keep protected. Okay. And it helps me to just map it out larger than what I actually need. But that is what I'm going to be doing 3 more times. And I would recommend having at least 8 spheres for today's practice. Okay. 4 is, well, the first time that I was working on this kind of exercise, it took me like 20 spheres to start getting things right. Okay. So don't feel bad or defeated if you don't end up with great spheres right off the bat, because there's a lot to think about here. Not only the different light and shadow sections, but also all of the watercolor, the brush and water control, the color mixing, and all that. It's quite a bit to have in mind. And so if this is your first time working on this kind of exercise, just please don't expect yourself to arrive at great looking results, and have patience with yourself. Okay? That is so important. And also, I will say, we're using watercolor, and watercolor is, you're not able to fully control watercolor super precisely. And it's a beautiful thing to allow the paint to do its thing when working with watercolor. Okay? It's not like when you're working with colored pencils or graphite pencils and you're shading something, you have way more control. Even when you're using painting mediums like acrylics or oils, you're not using too much water. So it's easier to control. But when you're working with watercolor, part of the beauty of the medium is allowing for the paint to do its thing, for these natural organic effects to happen as you're painting. So you're not going to be controlling everything super perfectly as you're painting. But as I said before, just having the different light and shadow sections in mind as you are developing your values is incredibly helpful. And within that, allow some space for movement and expansion and gradients and other effects to happen on their own. Okay? And I'm going to do 4 more in another sheet very quickly. This is a little lopsided. I'm going to fix this real quick. I'm going to prepare 4 more spheres or sphere outlines. These are not really spheres right now. They're very flat. But I'm going to prepare 4 more in another sheet so that I can have these ready to go. And then I'll grab my water, which I forgot to grab a bit ago. Of course I did. If you have any questions, let me know in the chats. 4 more. And again, for anyone who is just popping in, these circles are 3 inches in diameter, okay? 3 inches going across. Light source is on the upper left, so highlight is on the upper left. Cast shadow is on the lower right. For these spheres, we can imagine them as being in an environment where there is one single light source. I'm going to do the others. Okay, and one more. And then highlight, cast shadow. We will develop the core shadow, the occlusion shadow, and all these different sections as we're painting. But right now for our sketch, what's most important is to prepare or plan our highlight, because we need to keep that protected from the beginning, and to visualize where the cast shadow will be as well. The midtones and all that will be developing as we go. All right, and I'm all done. Okay, so I'm going to start with this one here. I'm going to place this one over here. And I'm gonna go ahead and grab some water. I have my sink right here in my studio, thankfully. I'll be right back. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to help you out with whatever you need. Okay, got my water. And I'm going to grab another towel and try to keep some order here. I'm not a very type A person, so I can get pretty messy as I'm painting. So I need to make an effort and try to keep things clean and organized here when I am teaching, so that I don't overwhelm people who are type A. If you are type A, I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best. Okay. Great. So now we can start. Is everyone ready? I'm going to clean out a section of my palette. I think that would be... Actually, I'm going to start with my purple. So I'm just going to use this section here first. All right, gonna have a sip of coffee, and we'll begin with our first exercise, which is going to be the monochromatic exercise. This will be a great opportunity to get the hang of the process while only using one single color. Okay? So as I said, we're gonna do first monochromatic, then analogous, then complementary, and then we'll come back and I'll teach you how to do glazing if you want to push the contrast even more. Because when working with watercolor, what happens is that the paint dries lighter than how it looks when it's wet. And so if you really want to push the realism, very often you'll see that we work in layers. We need to allow that first layer to dry, and then we come back and push darks with some glazing or layering, and only kind of layer over that darker area. I'll show you how to do that in just a bit. Have a sip of coffee and we'll begin. All right. Cool. So I seem to have no questions. I'm going to go ahead and start. All right. So we're going to start with the monochromatic exercise. All right. When you're shading things monochromatically, essentially, if you're using a very dark color like I did here in this sphere, which is this purple, okay, this is dioxazine violet from from Daniel Smith. It's not dioxazine violet, it's actually carbazole violet. I'm so sorry. Carbazole violet from Daniel Smith is what this purple is. It's very rich, it's very dark. So as I said, if you use a darker color, you're going to be able to achieve a wider range of values. I didn't soften my highlight here. I did soften my highlight over here, but I didn't soften it here. So see that difference? I didn't scrub here at the end. Here I did scrub. And you can see the pencil through that because, as I said, here we're using very watered down paint versus here, not as much. We're layering on more in that band. But anyway, so we're starting with the monochromatic where we're only using one single color. You need to use a darker color, okay? Think something like a darker blue, maybe even an ultramarine blue, ultramarine deep, indigo, a dark purple like I did here, anything like that. Choose that as your main color. And then you could bring in another color to darken this, but since we are doing things monochromatically in this first one, it would have to be a gray or a black, okay? Not a brown. Because if you start bringing in a brown, it'll change the color too much and it'll no longer be one same monochromatic color. in a monochromatic kind of study, we're using just one single color in its wide range of tones or values, okay? So when you start bringing in more colors, you're going to start changing the color, and it's no longer going to be monochromatic. So if you bring in a neutral gray, then it's still going to stay as that same color. Same way that it would stay that same color if I were to bring in white for my lighter values, but we don't need white because we're painting with watercolor. So what I would just recommend to keep things as simple as possible for this first exercise is just pick one single darker color, whether it's a violet, like what I'm going to be using here, or a darker blue, or even a darker green. For example, this undersea green from Daniel Smith, it's quite dark. I could use that for this exercise as well. But since I'm going to be using that later, I would just much rather just use the purple for this one. Okay? Does that make sense? Let me see if I have any questions. Hi, Paul. Nice to see you. Welcome. And no worries. This class is going to be available for you, the replay. Okay. So as I said, I'm using Carbazole Violet from Daniel Smith for this first monochromatic exercise. And what I'm doing here on my palette is I'm creating a nice juicy puddle. I like creating like a coffee or almost milk consistency from the start, because then what I do, this is a size 14 round brush, by the way. Then what I do is I bring in some water from my container and I take just a little bit of this color from the edge of my puddle. So I water down just a section of it so that I can start very, very light and build gradually toward my darker colors, okay? So here's what I do. If you want, you can see how I move through this one, and then I can give you a little bit more time so that you can do it on your own. The first thing that I do is I take a good amount of this watered down violet color, and what I do is I start by painting in this color all throughout the sphere, excluding, I'm gonna dip my brush in my container of water to just paint in water over this color and make sure that everything is super light. You want to keep things light in this first layer, okay? And make sure that you're running your paintbrush bristles over everything a few times. Don't just fill it in and start adding in another color or doing the next step, okay? Don't do that. Spend your time with this initial layer. Make sure that you are creating a nice light yellow or nice light layer to build on, okay? Because when we're working with watercolor, we are working from lights to darks, okay? So the first thing that you're doing is you're creating that initial lightest layer to build on, and you're staying away from the highlight because, as I've been saying, we need to keep that section protected throughout the entire process. So my intention here is to arrive at a light violet layer, and I am not going to start developing my darker values until I see a nice, even, glistening look all throughout this layer, all throughout this shape, excluding the highlight. And that will require, it depends on your environment that you're working in and the type of paper that you're using, but don't rush this process. It'll require you to go in sometimes with just a little bit of water in your brush and run your paintbrush bristles over everything multiple times. You don't want to flood your paper, but you want to arrive at an even sheen. See that? It's an even sheen. And right now, everything is still looking flat. Of course it's looking flat because we just have the highlight and we have like a lighter midtone. That's all we have. But once you start developing your range of values, things start taking form, okay? So now we're gonna move into the dark side, okay? Let's move into the dark side. So I'm gonna take more of this Carbazole Violet from my palette here. Now I can go in with a relatively thicker consistency And I'm going to focus on darkening the entire shadow side and maybe bringing in a little bit of a darker color right here to remember that crescent moon shape that I was talking about before. Okay. I want to darken the entire shadow side that we were talking about before, even the reflected light section, because remember how what I mentioned about how even the lighter values in the dark side have to be darker than the lighter values. Sorry, the lighter values in the dark side still need to be darker than the darkest values in the light side. Okay, so that is why I darkened all of the shadow side at once. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in more carbazole violet into my mix right here on my palette to thicken it up even more. And now I'm going in with more of a milk consistency. Remember that core shadow band, right? Where it is darkest inside of the subject. I go in with my darkest color, thickest carbazole violet there. Okay. Okay, Suzanne, see you later. Have fun. Okay, so now we have a nice range of values, but I need to work on my transitions a little bit more, okay? Right here, things are looking a little bit too light. I need to work on my halftones. That gradient between the lighter values and the darker values, I need to work on that, okay? Things are still wet and workable because I took my time with the pre-wetting process. If I had rushed it, things would be starting to dry and I wouldn't be able to work anymore, because if I did work when sections of my paper are already starting to dry, that is just a surefire way of arriving at texture and splotchiness and backgrounds and stuff like that, okay? So you can see I haven't done any blending at all. I place my paint and I allow the paint to do its thing. The more blending you do, the more you're going to flatten things out, okay? So try to place your paint confidently based on those essential areas that I was talking about in the beginning of this lesson, and leave things alone as much as possible. I have some texture here, but I didn't go in and try to fix that. Anyway, before my paper starts to dry on me, I need to work on these kind of halftone gradients right here so that things flow a little bit more naturally or softly. Okay. And very, very gently, if you need to go in, if you have like a spidery cauliflower effect, something like that, just go in with the tip of your paintbrush and soften. If your paper is still wet, you can do that. But be very careful and don't start blending like this, okay? Because that is going to flatten everything out. It's going to defeat the purpose, okay? You can drop in a little bit more paint in this area if you want to create a softer gradient, right? And that is pretty much it. If I wanted to darken the let's just say that I need to darken the band, the core shadow a little bit more. If my paper is still wet and workable, I can add in more carbazole violet into my puddle, thicken it up, and drop it in again into this section. But remember, watercolor is going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. And I think this light is casting a little bit too much of a glare on my painting. So I'm just going to turn it off. Anyway, so watercolor is going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So if you were not able to achieve that range of values that you wanted in this first layer, no worries. You can do it in a second layer. I'll show you how to do glazing after we go through all of these once, okay? I'll show you. And you can adjust things and you can sculpt the sphere if you want. But again, you need to stay mindful. When your paper is starting to dry, you need to stop. And it's best to do whatever work you want to do in another layer. Okay? But as you can see, I have my reflected light, I have my core shadow, I have my halftones, I have my direct light area, and I have my highlight. Okay? This right here is a very sharp edge around my highlight. So if I wanted to go in and soften, there are a few different things that I can do. The first thing is I can allow that to dry completely. And then once everything is dry, I can come in and do some scrubbing along the edge with my scrubber brush, or any kind of stiffer bristled brush will do just fine. Another thing I can do is go in with my absorbent towel. I like wrapping it around my finger like this and simply dabbing just very carefully around the edge. That works sometimes, depending on how dry or damp your paint is. And another thing that you can do is you can also go in while the paint is still wet with a clean and slightly damp brush. Maybe you want a bit of this is a size 8. And with a clean and slightly damp brush, you can soften the edge. Just run your paintbrush bristles along the edge that you're wanting to soften. And that is another way that you can soften the edge, okay? Any of those are perfectly fine strategies to soften your edges. But this way, it won't look as stark. It won't look as stark. I need to work on my kind of pronunciation. Anyway, so yeah, I wouldn't paint the cast shadow until this is dry, because if I start painting this right now, since this is wet right here, this paint is going to start seeping or bleeding into my sphere, and I can destroy my reflected light section if I'm not careful, okay? So just have a little bit more control. I'm going to allow that to dry. We can paint in all the spheres, and then at the end, we can come back and paint the shadows, okay? But that is it. That is essentially what the monochromatic sphere or study is, okay? You can see how, or imagine how, if I had used a lighter color, like say a yellow or a warm yellow or an orange, those colors are too light. So I'm not going to be able to create that very dark section and that range of values or tones that I need for believable depth using just those two colors. So that is where the analogous comes in. And not that you only use it in those situations. You can use the analogous color scheme for shading for many, many situations. But say you wanted to shade a yellow object, you can go with an orange or a red and develop darker values by bringing in some orange or red into the yellow. But this is what I wanted to explain, is that depending on the subject that you are painting, sometimes the analogous color scheme is not going to work. Like, for example, let's just say that I am painting a delicious baked, I don't know, like a croissant or something like that, like a bread, okay? I am not going to be bringing in orange and red to darken my yellows. Okay, so say you start with maybe a yellow ochre, which is essentially a neutralized yellow, or a more, it's a beigey, very light kind of golden neutral. Okay, say you start with a yellow ochre, or maybe even like a warm yellow for your base color for your croissant. You're not going to be adding red into the yellow that you choose as your base color to darken the yellow, because your croissant is going to start turning red. And that is not a hue, it's not a color that you want when you're painting that object. Same thing with the banana. Bananas are not red. So I'm not going to be bringing in the analogous color to yellow, which is orange and red, to shade a banana. It would turn into a completely different color that I don't want for that object, right? And so what do I do in those situations? That's when I go with a neutral, with a brown, with a burnt sienna, a burnt umber, a sepia, okay? Not a gray. I tend to bring in grays. I do enjoy having Payne's gray on my palette. And I bring in Payne's gray to darken colors whenever I want to keep the color a Payne's gray is cool bias. It's like a black with a blue. Payne's gray is a combination of blue and black. So it is a gray that has a cooler temperature to it. It's not like a neutral flat black. You can say that it is slightly, ever so slightly changing the temperature of the color that you added to. But using a gray is going to keep the color cleaner than using a brown. Okay. So whenever I want to keep my color cleaner or more like that same color, but a darker version of it, I use a gray. And whenever I want a warmer kind of not black looking, because I'm not going to bring in a black into a baked good. It's going to look burnt. You know what I mean? I just want a slightly darker version of a yellow, and brown is a perfect color to add into a yellow for that kind of situation, right? Let's see if I have any questions. Okay. So are analogous colors your default for creating shadows, and you only use a complementary if the analogous isn't going to work, like with the banana? I wouldn't use, I mean, you can use complementary colors for a banana, Heather, but honestly, I would personally reach for a burnt sienna or a ready-made brown, like a burnt umber or even a sepia in those situations. So I would say that the complementary color scheme for shading, Heather, is more versatile once you know how to use it than the analogous color scheme for shading specifically. But there are situations where it is just simpler to reach for a brown, like when I am painting bread, like when I am painting a banana, or things that are yellow objects where I want the yellow to stay like a brighter yellow or like a golden yellow. I don't want to mess with a color very much. I reach for a little bit of brown to darken the yellow. And the complementary color scheme, and this is not like this is not a rule, Heather. I don't, because different artists, like, you could use the complementary color scheme for anything, okay? Because complementary colors, essentially all you do is take a little bit of the colors complementary, opposite in the color wheel. For those of you who don't know, complementary colors are opposites in the color wheel, okay? Analogous colors are colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, all right? So when you add in a little bit of the colors complementary in the color wheel, all you're going to do is darken it a little bit. When you start adding more, say you start creating like a 50-50 mix of two complementary colors, you're going to start getting a gray. We're going to see that in just a bit, okay? You're going to get a gray. But if you just want to darken it a little bit, all you need to do is add in a little bit of the colors complementary, not too much, okay? And in that case, really, the complementary color scheme could work for anything. Whereas the analogous color scheme, it has to work for the subject or the object that you are painting, because sometimes it's not as easy as just taking the lighter or darker color that is next to your base color in the color wheel, because it can change the color completely. Does that make sense? Okay, so you kind of need to know, like, or foresee what is going to happen when you mix in different colors into your first one. See what happened here, where because things were very wet there, I was left at the end with a sharp defined line, which is exactly what I was trying to correct. This situation could have been avoided by me simply waiting for things to dry completely and doing my scrubbing at the end after everything had dried. That happened because I softened the edge while everything was still wet. So that's why I give you different techniques. I am going to end up having to go in and do my scrubbing at the end because this happened anyway. And what happens oftentimes when you try to soften the edge while the paint is still wet is that you end up with no highlight because the paint is still moving too much. And if you wet everything accidentally, you're going to be left with no highlight. Okay? So if you want a little bit more control, wait for things to dry and soften at the end after things have dried. Okay? Anyway, what was I saying? So it is important that you foresee what's going to happen. Complementary colors are going to mute each other out. They're going to neutralize each other. You're going to end up with a darker, but also a grayer, more desaturated version of your initial color. Whereas when you use analogous colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, those colors are going to remain vibrant and saturated because you're almost using this. They are very similar colors and they don't mute each other down. Complementaries do mute each other down. Okay. Alrighty. I feel like I know how to mix shadow colors, but not when to use each kind. Yes. Okay. That is an excellent kind of comment or observation, Heather. And I'm glad that you brought that up. It's, I think, part of the reason why we need to know these different methods, these different strategies or techniques, whatever you want to call them, and explore them. And then once you have this knowledge and these skills, depending on what it is that you're painting, you're going to pull from a different tool, from a different technique. And sometimes, Heather, I'm not going to lie, sometimes I'm painting something. Before starting with any new painting, I make sure to plan my colors, right? This is something I always explain, like plan your colors, know what you're going to be doing for your color mixing and how you're going to be developing your values, because otherwise you're going to be left with, like, you can easily be left with muddy colors or undesired colors, stuff like that. But every single situation, Heather, every different thing that you're painting is going to require you bringing in your critical thinking skills and planning for your color mixing, maybe swatching mixtures out, maybe doing little color studies. A lot of professional artists do color studies and value studies before working on the final piece, precisely for this reason. Okay. And they've been at it for a long time and they still do it. Okay. Many times you plan things out and still sometimes things don't turn out and you want to do that. This happens to me all the time. I need to redo a painting twice or even 3 times, especially when working with watercolor, because you can't really layer paint on and correct mistakes like you could with other painting mediums. So oftentimes with watercolor, it's best to just restart instead of trying to sit there and correct, depending on the size of the mistake. But when it comes to choosing your colors, like that is a key part of the process, because again, you can't really correct watercolor like you could with other painting mediums. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. And for this one, we're going to be going with the analogous color scheme. Okay, so let's just say that I want this sphere to be green. All right, I am going to, actually, I'm going to clean this out because this is a complementary mix that I had right here. So it looks very gray and I want my green sphere to be a little bit brighter. But this sphere is going to be green. And let's just say that I want this sphere to look green, okay? So the green that I have here on my palette, which is a green I love, is called Undersea Green, okay? This is Undersea Green from Daniel Smith. It is a deeper, mossier, more like warmer, natural looking green, right? Let me swatch this out for you so that you can see what it looks like, just so you can get an idea. All right. This is a pretty dark green, wouldn't you say, compared to other greens that I have had in the past? So what I'm going to do, I don't need a darker color to bring in because this is already quite dark. So grabbing my color wheel right here, Okay, let's just say this is definitely a cooler looking green, but let's say that I want my sphere to look green. I can go blue to make it look darker, or I can go toward the yellow to make it look lighter. This green is already pretty dark, so I don't need to go darker. I'm sure I'm going to be able to develop a nice range of values with just that green because it's pretty dark. Okay? Just like this purple is pretty dark. So, what I need are lighter colors for me to lighten the green and be able to develop my wide range of values with a yellow. I don't want to just use my green throughout because as I was mentioning before, yes, you're going to be able to develop a nice range of values with one single color if you're using a darker color. However, in real life, when you're actually painting something, let's say you're trying to paint a pear, okay? I can't just use that green to paint my pear. I need to bring in another color to lighten it and create light and a realistic natural look in my painting. You're really never going to use one single color. So while this is a great exercise, when you're actually painting something, you're going to have to bring in a darker color to darken or a lighter color to lighten, or both. Okay? Okay, let's see. So here on my palette, I'm going to bring in this lemon yellow color. This is a cool yellow. And I'm going to create a lighter version of my green by mixing in a little bit of this undersea green into the yellow. And this is going to be the color that I start with because we start with our lighter colors. Okay? Let's see. All right, let's see if I have any questions. All right, this may be for a different class, but I'd love to hear more about how you do color studies. Also, if you're painting something like a landscape, would you use the same method for creating shadows for the house, trees, or grass? Hold on, let me pay more closer attention. I was distracted by a helicopter that is going by. If you're painting something like a landscape, would you use the same method for creating shadows for the house, trees, and grass, for example? Or would you make those decisions when object? That is a great question, Heather. I think it depends on the landscape. It depends on the landscape. But you usually, when it comes to painting fuller scenes, I try to limit my color palette from the start so that I can repeat colors throughout the scene. And if the shadow color is something that I can repeat, I will certainly do that. And I will decide from the beginning whether I'm going to be bringing in a gray or even a blue for my shadow areas or something like that. And then I mix that gray or that blue or even that purple into my different colors for shadow sections. So whenever I can, I will do that. Okay, but it does make sense. When it comes to a complete painting, I try to keep my colors consistent in my shadow areas and in my light areas. Okay. If you start bringing, because for the most part, if you, maybe you've heard this before, but when there is a warm light in the environment, it's a good idea to use cooler colors for your shadows. And when there is a cool color or a cooler light in the environment, sometimes you do the opposite and you use warmer colors. The reason why I'm saying this is because if you start bringing in different, like if you start shading something or creating a shadow with a brown in one area and then creating a shadow with a blue in another area, those shadows, some of them are going to end up looking warmer and some of them are going to end up looking cooler, and you're going to like destroy the consistency in the environment. Hope that makes sense. Would love to hear more about how you do color studies. I have many classes on color studies over on Patreon, workshops that I've created for the Rising Star tier, Heather. So I'm not super sure what tier you are a part of, But most of my more in-depth art fundamentals lessons and workshops are available for that tier if you're interested. I do have a sorry, a video. God, I do have a video on YouTube and on Patreon available for all tiers, which I shared a while back, where I am working on a series of pen and wash, line and wash, a still life little drawing where you're seeing me use different color schemes in each little study. And that is available here on YouTube and over on Patreon for all tiers if you're interested in that. Okay, cool. So I have my two mixes ready right here. So as I said, all I am using are yellow and green for this analogous color study, okay? Yellow and green. You could pick anything. You could pick orange and red, yellow and orange, purple and blue, any set of analogous colors. Just go with two colors. Don't make it super complicated and start bringing in three colors. If you want your sphere to appear red, try using a violet to darken the red, right? If you want your sphere to look orange, try bringing in a red to darken the orange. If you want your sphere to look yellow, try bringing in a green. Or if you want it to look yellow, but it's okay if it starts leaning toward the orange, bring a little bit of red into the yellow, okay? And so on and so forth. If you want your sphere to appear green, but you want it to look cooler in the shadow areas, bring in blue to darken your green. So you can do this with any two colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. And you don't have to reach for a blue-green. The thing about the color wheel is that you're also going to see the tertiary colors. Okay, tertiaries are mixtures of a secondary and a primary. They are in between of. Blue-green is a mix of blue and green. So if you're painting a sphere that is blue and you want to use a dark green for your shadow areas, instead of going with a blue-green, just go with a green. Okay, just go with a green, because by mixing these two together, you're going to end up with a blue-green. Okay, same thing with this. If you want to paint a violet sphere and you want to go with blue for your shadow color, just go with a blue. Okay, you don't need to go with a blue purple, because you're going to end up with a blue purple when you mix these two together. Okay, so as long as you're choosing a color that is next to your base color, and what I mean with base color is, what is the base color that you want your sphere to be? Choose whatever color you want, and then just choose the adjacent primary or secondary, and just go with that. Okay, for your analogous. Okay, I have to reactivate this. So I start with my lighter green with plenty of yellow in it, and the process is going to be exactly the same, where I start with my lighter color, I paint this in, dip my brush into my container, and go over the entire thing multiple times. Okay. Dip again. Sometimes I'm just going in with water in my brush to soften the color and to run my paintbrush bristles over everything multiple times, because I'm looking for that even sheen, okay? Take your time with this, don't rush it. And when you're done with this first layer, it's gonna appear flat because you just have your highlight and you just have this first lightest value. That's all you have. Okay, I think I'm good. I'm gonna show you this even glistening. See that even glistening there? That means that I can start working. Okay. Okay, so now I'm gonna start adding a little bit more green into my puddle to darken it. I don't want to go too dark though, so I'm going to add yellow into this and make sure that I'm going in with not a full undersea green because that's a little bit too dark. So I want to make my way gradually towards my darker colors. Okay, so now remember the next step. I'm going to go in and darken the entire shadow section, visualizing the terminator line that we were talking about in the beginning of the class. And I'm going to darken the entire shadow side, all of these planes that are facing away from the light, and it can even start seeping into your halftones and your light side, okay? That's going to happen when you're painting with watercolor. The paint is going to move around, it's going to do its thing. It's fine, okay? Don't go crazy trying to correct things because you're going to flatten things out. All right, now I'm going to add a little bit more undersea green into the mix to darken it. And now I'm going to visualize that core shadow, that dark band in the sphere, which is darkest because no light reaches that section of the object directly, and there is no reflected light bouncing back into this area either. Okay. Now, as you can see, the same thing happened where I need to do a little bit more work in my halftones, okay? That's fine. I remove this green from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and I'm going in with a slightly lighter green that has more yellow in it, and I'm just gonna very gently go into my halftone section to create a bit of a softer transition into the darks. I'm not going over everything and over blending, okay? If you want to lift up a little bit of color, do it, but do so carefully using just the tip of your brush. Everything is still wet and workable, so I can do things. All right. Awesome. And now if you need to do any sculpting, if you want to go even darker in the core shadow section and you want to go in with your plain darker color, whatever it is that you chose, go in, visualize the curve always, because this is a curved object. You don't want to go in with a straight line. And sculpt. As long as your paper is still wet. If your paper is already starting to dry, it's preferable to allow everything to dry completely and then do whatever work you want to do in another layer, okay? If you want to continue working on your halftones or your central light area, just make sure that you're going in with your green that has plenty of yellow in it. Otherwise, you're going to darken the light side too much. Okay. I think this looks a little bit too much like a straight line, so I'm just going to correct that very gently. Turn it into more of a curve. All right. Okay, so I don't want to do too much and start overworking things. I'm going to leave it as is. Again, you need to decide what softening technique works best for you. If you want to go in with your absorbing towel and just lift up a little bit of color. If you want to soften with a clean and slightly damp brush, just remember that this can happen. If you go in right now while everything is still wet, this can end up happening, and you're gonna have to go in later to soften after everything has dried once again. Okay, so you can see how the highlight ends up being smaller than what I initially mapped out. Okay. I'm going to go in and paint the cast shadow on this one because it's completely dry. So I wanted to go in and paint the cast shadow. I rinse out my brush. I don't want to go in with green into the monochromatic study. So I go in initially with more of a coffee consistency, I would say. And by the way, I do have tutorials where I explain about the different paint consistencies when working with watercolor. If you're just getting started with watercolor and you have no idea what I'm talking about when I'm saying tea or coffee or milk, these are different consistencies that we work with when painting with watercolor that we have to become comfortable with. Okay, so yeah, so I just painted one flat color initially in my cast shadow with my purple. And then I add in more carbazole violet into the mix, thicken it up. And then for my occlusion shadow, I simply pop in a little bit more of this purple nearest the object. Okay, there you go. So now, cast shadows are very important when you are trying to develop realism because they really help convey that sense of mass blocking the light. Okay, and for this little thing that happened, if everything is dry over here, so if I wanted to go in with my scrubber brush and gently do some scrubbing and lifting, I can do that at this point. And as I said, you don't have to have a scrubber brush. For a very long time, I just used a round brush for my scrubbing, as long as it's a bit of a, your bristles cannot be super soft. If you want to go in to do scrubbing, that's not going to work. So you do need a bit of a, not necessarily super stiff, but just, you know, they have to have the bounce to them. You know, this would be good for scrubbing as well, because it's not that kind of watercolor brush where when you wet the bristles, they kind of bend to the side. They do have a snap to them. Those kinds of brushes tend to work well for scrubbing as well. But as you can see, I was able to soften that, okay? I'm gonna wait for that to dry because right now everything here is still wet. And if I try to soften, the same thing is gonna happen where I'm just gonna end up with no highlight, possibly. And I also cannot paint the cast shadow because this is still wet. And if I start painting in my green there, it's the darker green is going to start seeping into my reflected light area. And I don't want that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and change my water because this is what my water is looking like right now. And we need to work on the complementary color scheme right now. And I don't want this to affect my colors. So I'll be right back. And if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, I'm back. All right, so we're gonna work on a complementary sphere right now. And yeah, then we'll go back and do another analogous one and so on and so forth so that we can get at least 8 spheres in. But we're gonna work faster with the last 4, okay? All right, so let's just say that I want to use green and red, which are opposite colors in the color wheel. Green is opposite to red in the color wheel, okay? So are blue and orange, so are violet and yellow. All of those are complementary colors. And what happens when you add in a bit of the colors complementary is that you're going to darken it and you're also going to be muting it simultaneously. When you use analogous colors, you don't really mute the colors down unless one of your colors is already a little bit muted. For example, this undersea green from Daniel Smith is already quite muted. It's a more natural, muted looking green. So overall, I'm going to end up with slightly muted effects, even though those colors are analogous and I use the analogous color scheme. So it depends on the colors that you're using. But let's just say that for this one, I want to paint a I can try to make my sphere red, or I can try to make it green and then just add the opposite, a little bit of the opposite to darken my values. So let's just say that I want this sphere to appear red. I'm going to clean out a little section of my palette right here. And I'm going to be using alizarin crimson, which is a cool red, and viridian green, which is a cool green. Just as an FYI, but I would recommend losing that fear and just experimenting with different colors for yourself, because that is the fastest way to grow. Okay, so viridian green is a cool blue biased green. Let me swatch this out for you. It's very different from the undersea green, which is warmer. Okay, viridian green looks like this. Very, very different greens. Okay, this is a warm green, this is a cool green. And then I'm gonna do alizarin crimson for my red, which is a cool red. And I do have many classes where I explain about color temperature, essential color theory for beginners on my channel. You can check it out. This is a cool red. I'm gonna mix these two together, and let's just say I wanna make my sphere red, okay? So I'm gonna start with a watered down red. It's really the same technique that I'm using to paint these spheres. It's just different colors and mixtures that I'm using. But I'm gonna start with a very watered down red. And then as I move into my darker values, I bring in more and more green. If you mix together green with red, you're gonna notice you start getting a gray. Okay, remember how I said that if you mix enough of two complementaries together, you're gonna start getting a grayish or a brownish looking color. Depending on the specific colors that you choose, you're always gonna end up with a grayish brownish looking color. I don't want to have a gray. I just want my red to get a little bit darker, okay, than my initial red, my plain alizarin crimson, okay? So all I need to do is add in a little bit of green and it's going to become darker. Okay. See that? Just by adding a little bit of green, I darken it. And also it becomes a little bit more muted. Okay. So depending on how dark you want to get, you just add a little bit more green and a little bit more green. Do it gradually. Okay. Do it gradually, but you probably don't need to go any darker than this. You probably don't need to add any more green than this. As long as you're using your color in a thicker consistency, this is already dark enough. I'm probably going to develop a nice range of values just with this amount of green. Now, what's hard as well when you're using complementaries is that you're using colors that are very different from each other. They're opposites in the color wheel. You can't get any more different than that, okay? And it's hard because you need to account for not only the value, but also the consistency of paint that you're using. Because one of the hardest things about working with watercolor is that you're not only constantly changing the color to color ratios in your mixtures, but you're also changing the paint to water ratios in your mixtures. Because both color and water affect the value that you're creating. And so if I were to use this darker version of my red in a very watered down consistency, it's going to look light. It's going to look lighter than this, which is my lighter red, you know? So you need to also be making your mixtures thicker as you go, especially once you're trying to develop your darker values. Remember that when working with watercolor, usually at the start of the process, when you're developing those lightest lights, you're using more water, okay? And then as you go, as you move forward and you start developing your darker colors, your darker areas, You're using less water, thicker paint. Okay. So have that in combination with the mixture, like why we're doing this, why we're bringing green into the red. We're trying to darken the red, yes. But if I use this darker mixture, very watered down, it's still at the end going to appear as a different, lighter value than this, which is a lot thicker. So you're not going to be able to develop a darker value by placing that on top of the red because it's very watered down. You need to go thick, okay? You need to add in enough paint into your mixture. Otherwise, it's not going to appear dark enough. And you're going to be fighting with your study, okay? Because you're going to be adding the what you think is going to be the darker color, but you're not really darkening anything because it has too much water in it. And this water control develops in time. You can't, it's something that you have to go through. It's not something that you can magically develop from one day to the next, because it becomes an intuitive part of your creating, of your painting process, until you have done it enough. You need to feel the water, you need to feel the paint, you need to feel what it's like to bring out enough paint into your mixtures. And you, through doing it enough, it becomes natural, it becomes intuitive, it becomes something you no longer have to think about because you do it mechanically. Like it's just something that you do as you're painting, but you need to do it enough in order to build up that, in order to see it if it's watery enough, in order to feel if it's thick enough. Okay, hope that makes sense. Anyway, let's get started. So I'm going to start with this watered down alizarin crimson from the edge of my puddle. Same process here, where I start painting my first lightest layer, dipping my brush in my container. You can see how light this alizarin crimson looks because it's very watered down, and I'm even dipping my brush in my container and bringing out more water onto my paper. Run your paintbrush bristles over everything a few times so that you see that even sheen. And then once you see that even sheen, we're going in still just with the alizarin crimson, not bringing in the green yet, just going slightly thicker. Okay. Maybe more of a coffee consistency this time instead of tea. And I'm painting my entire shadow side, visualizing the Terminator line. All right. And there we go. So this is my, you could say that at this point I have 3 values developed, maybe a bit of a gradient in some sections. But the wider the range of values, the more of a 3D look you develop, okay? And here, if I want to soften the gradient a little bit, just very, very carefully and minimally go in. Maybe I want to bring a tiny bit of this paint toward the central light section. Here, for example, if I want to push this back, I'm just going to use my brush to absorb that. And I'm going to start with my sculpting. Okay. Now here you can try to tell yourself, maybe I can go in with a thicker alizarin crimson first into the core shadow band. And then I start adding in my Viridian green little by little. Okay, I can even test this out, try to tell if it's a very stark kind of transition. I think that's good. Make sure that the consistency is more of a milk consistency as well. I don't want to go in with a watery, super watered down. See how dark this looks? I don't want to go in with a super watered down consistency at this point when I'm building up the darker values. Okay. And from here, I'm going to work on those midtones, the halftones again. I'm going to make sure not to bring this down into my reflected light section. I want to keep that lighter. But I'm going to bring in more alizarin so that I can work on those halftones a little bit more, work on that transition in the light side. I don't want to go in with green in that section. I want to keep that section lighter, so I'm going to make sure to just go in with alizarin. No green. And work on sculpting that sphere. Soften this transition with a clean and slightly damp brush. And there are artists who I'm going to continue sculpting this. As long as my paper is still wet, I can still do a little bit of softening or darkening, sorry. What I was going to say is that there are artists who enjoy creating an underpainting where they use the colors complementary to create a base, an underpainting, and just that's like, for example, if I wanted my let's just say I'm painting like a red apple, okay? You can create an underpainting using green, okay? Develop a nice range of values just with green. And then over that, you can paint with red after it has dried. There are people who do that process. So there are many, many ways that you can use complementary colors. Gonna darken just a little bit more in the core shadow. Envisioning that like crescent moon shape. And now I'm gonna use a little bit more of my alizarin. More alizarin. Paying attention to how wet my paper is. I'm probably gonna have to stop working in just a bit. My edges are looking a little bit raggedy, so I'm gonna go in and clean those up with a clean, slightly damp brush. And I'm going to allow this to dry. Maybe I want just a tiny bit of alizarin over here. Just plain alizarin. And if you wanted to go in to do some lifting, maybe your dark color expanded too much, you can lift up in the reflected light area right here in the underside of the object if you want to. That's it. I don't want to do too much. I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to go ahead and paint in the cast shadow in my green sphere with my undersea green. Plain undersea green in, say, a coffee consistency, and then you add more paint into the mix to darken it, and you darken the occlusion shadow section. Darken the mix by adding more green, and darken this section nearest the object. And then if I wanted to go in to do some gentle scrubbing to soften the highlight shape, go back to my scrubber brush or a stiffer bristled round. And with a damp brush, I just go in to do some gentle scrubbing. Whoop, that's it. How are you guys doing? Any questions so far? Okay. I'm gonna have some coffee. So we have gone through Monochromatic, analogous, complementary. And I do want to share the glazing technique with you as well, because it's a super important technique to know when you're painting with watercolor, which can help you increase the tonal range even more and add more depth to your paintings. Because, as I said, watercolor will dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So if you're one of those artists who really enjoys higher levels of realism, you're very likely going to work in layers. You're going to allow a layer to dry completely and then come back and deepen and darken shadow areas in another layer. Okay? And I'll show you how to do that. But in the meantime, we need to continue practicing this. Okay, so I'm going to continue. I have this entire sheet with 4 more, and I'm going to work on these myself. Okay, I'm going to do more of these two, which for me, at my current skill level, I can benefit more from working on these two and more specifically working on complementary color scheme more. If you need to go back to work on this one, go back and work on your monochromatic. If you cannot do this, then this is more difficult than this, and this is more difficult than this. So I would recommend, if you struggled with this one, continue doing more monochromatic spheres and get comfortable with the process that I'm sharing with you. And visualizing your highlights, your central light, your halftones, and your core shadow, and all this. That is enough for you, okay, right now. And then once you're comfortable, move on to the analogous, and then move on to the complementary. So what I'm going to be doing right now is I'm just going to work on another analogous, then more complementaries in my next spheres. And I'm going to be switching between different colors. Maybe I'm going to do an orange one, a red one, a blue one. It doesn't really matter what colors you choose, as long as you are choosing them intentionally based on a specific scheme, okay? Maybe I can even show you how I would create shadows with, say, a brown or a gray. Sure, why not? Okay, let's do that. But the painting process is the same, okay? All right. Let's do a shading. A shading. Let's do a sphere using a brown or a gray, okay? Let's just say that perhaps I'm planning the colors that I'm going to be using for a croissant, or maybe I'm going to paint some avocado toast or something like that. And I need to decide on the colors that I'm going to be using for the bread. Okay. So let me clean this out. And I need to leave these towels to dry because they are soaked. My towels are soaked. The good thing about these is that they dry very quickly. I'll grab a new one. Okay. Oops. All right. So let's do a color study for, say, a croissant. Okay. I do have a full tutorial where I'm painting a croissant. It's pretty old, but you'll find it if you want to follow along. So let's say that my base color that I choose for my croissant is yellow ochre. Okay, so yellow, this is a drier paint color right here, so I really need to swivel water in there and bring some out. Let me show this to you. This is very similar to a raw sienna. Okay. I would say that this is a beautiful color for a base color for a bread, a baked good, right? So that is going to be my base color. And then I'm going to add, say, what do I have here? I have raw umber. I have burnt sienna. This is burnt sienna. The burnt sienna is a reddish brown, but it doesn't go super dark. It looks like this. So I will be able to develop a nice range of values if I use my burnt sienna and I add it into my yellow ochre to darken it. However, I do have this burnt umber as well, which is darker, but it is also probably going to make my croissant look burnt or something if I use that brown, which is, this burnt sienna is redder, it's cooler. So if I added, I think just by having seen croissants in my life and maybe even stemming from a reference photo where I'm actually seeing a croissant, my observation will tell me that a croissant is more, this is going to go more with that object than this brown, which is probably going to make it look burnt if I start using this and this. Okay, look, you can start getting a feeling for what those colors will mix, like what it will look like. Okay, so I'm just gonna go with the burnt sienna. And then if I'm not able to develop that range of values that I want for depth, I can simply go in with another layer and use the burnt sienna in a thicker consistency in a second layer. Okay, so first color, yellow ochre. And same idea where I'm going in with the yellow ochre in a very watered down consistency first, okay? Taking a little bit of color from the edge of my puddle and making my way around the highlight. Taking my time with this until I arrive at an even sheen and no section is starting to dry too fast. Remember that if your color is looking too dark or you simply want to make it lighter, you can just dip your brush in your container, remove the excess water. Whenever I dip my brush in my container, I always scrape the top of my bristles on the top of my container, okay? Because you don't want to drown your paper with water, because if your paper is too wet, you're not going to have any control at all. You want an even glistening, no puddles. And once you see that even sheen all throughout this area, I'm going to add more yellow ochre into this to first use the same color in a thicker consistency so that I can create that next step before getting into my darker colors. So I'm going in and visualizing the terminator line, which is a curve. It's a curved line. Painting in the same color all throughout the shadow section, maybe even bringing in a little bit of the same color into the edges over here in the central light section. Rinse out my brush, remove that excess water. If you want to go in to pull a little bit of this paint into the central light section to soften transitions, you can. And once you have those two, well, now you could say at this point that I have three values: my highlights, my lightest value, which is in the central light section, and this darker midtone. It's still very light, but it's a midtone in the shadow side. So at this point, I can start bringing in some of my burnt sienna into the yellow ochre. I don't want to go too dark just yet. I'm mixing the two colors together, maybe even test it out to make sure that it is not super stark looking. Maybe a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more yellow ochre. Account for the consistency, because now you're trying to develop darker values, so you can't go in with a tea consistency or even a coffee consistency. Try to go for more of a milk consistency once you start developing your core shadow and your darker values, okay? Now visualize that terminator line again, and right along that terminator line, you start painting in your core shadow. Remove this paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water. And I need to work on my central light a little bit more because this is too stark of a transition. So I'm gonna go back to my yellow ochre, more yellow ochre, plain yellow ochre. I want just yellow ochre on the light side, no burnt sienna. I'm gonna add in a little bit of yellow ochre alongside the core shadow, which right now I can't see it anymore. So I need to go in and darken the core shadow. Soften this. Keep those lightest values around my highlight. And I need to darken the core shadow. Now I can barely see the core shadow. So I'm going to add more burnt sienna, go in nice and thick, more of a milk consistency, and enforce and push the core shadow because it became too light. Sometimes you go in and you think something looks dark, but then you do your work around that section and it no longer looks dark anymore. It's always a back and forth and coming back to see how things are looking and doing any necessary changes or pushing areas or lightening areas, pushing others, so on and so forth. Okay, so just continue doing your sculpting, whatever you need to do. Make sure you're rinsing out your brush in between your colors, and if you're working in the light section, make sure that you're only going in with your first color, none of the second. I'm going to continue creating softer transitions and sculpting my sphere a little bit more while I still can. My paper is still wet. I want a crescent moon shape. Little bit of yellow ochre. And there we go. Okay, I don't want to do too much. I'm gonna quickly smooth out edges. And now that I have done this, this is essentially a color study. If I had a specific object in mind that I wanted to paint, right? In this case, a croissant or a baked good or a cake, a vanilla cake, something like that. These two colors, the yellow ochre and the burnt sienna, would be an excellent choice because I can now see that they work very well together to create the lights, the midtones, and the darks, which tells me that I would be able to use this combination of colors when painting that specific type of object, okay? This would work a lot better for a baked good than, say, bringing in something like I started with my yellow ochre. Bringing in a green doesn't make sense for a baked good. And bringing in a red doesn't really make sense either, because the croissant is going to start turning red or orange. I don't want my croissant to look red, right? I want it to look more like a golden brownish color. So it's important to develop your observational skills as an artist when you're choosing your colors and make sure that you're using the technique and the colors that make sense for that specific object, okay? If I were shading an orange or a clementine, sure, I would be able to go with the red because clementines are red orange. If you see a clementine, certain sections look red orange. So I could go with the analogous red oranges and reds if I were shading an orange. But for a croissant, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in my cast shadows. I can't do this yet for this one, but I can do it for this one. For this one, I was using complementary colors. So going back to those two, which were alizarin crimson and viridian green. For this one, I would go with a mix of both for my cast shadow because it's a dark shape, and then simply thicken up that same mixture or add in a little bit more green for my occlusion shadow. I wouldn't start with a red or with a plain red because the cast shadow is already a darker zone, right? Okay, I'm gonna add in a little bit more alizarin. I'm sorry, Viridian, a little bit more alizarin, a little bit more Viridian. And I'm gonna pop this into the occlusion shadow section to make it look darker. There we go. And now for my softening, I go back to my scrubber brush, dip it in my container, remove that excess water, and scrub along the edges. When it comes to scrubbing, just as an FYI, one of the characteristics of watercolor which differentiate it from other painting mediums, make it different from other painting mediums, is the fact that it can reactivate after it has dried. Okay, so this means that you could have painted something 2 weeks ago, and if you go back, sorry, a plane or something is going by. If you go back in with a wet brush and you start scrubbing, the paint will reactivate. Okay. So we can use that characteristic to our advantage to soften, to scrub, to create textures even. But it is important to know that depending on the specific paint color that you used and the specific paper that you used, sometimes that color just won't budge as much as others. This depends mostly on the paint color's staining quality, okay? Every single paint color has different staining qualities, different levels of granulation, transparency, whether it's transparent, semi-transparent, opaque, or semi-opaque. Okay, there are different characteristics that every paint color has, and its staining is one of them. If you're using a very staining color, you won't be able to lift as much after it has dried. So that's just something to have in mind, okay? All right, so I'm gonna just work through the following 4 a lot faster now that we have gone through this 4 times. I'm gonna change my water as well because it's looking very murky. So I'm going to start by using gray to darken a color so that we can see the difference between using a gray and using a brown. And then I'll move on to painting the other 3 with either the complementary or the analogous schemes so that I can continue practicing that, okay? Wherever you are, however those last 4 or the first 4 went, just do whatever practice you personally have to do. Okay, we're all at different points, and please don't feel bad if none of your spheres are turning out. Okay, don't feel bad. It's just a matter of practice. I promise you that I had to paint like 20-30 spheres in order to just arrive at my first decent looking sphere. Okay, you have to give yourself time. Be patient. This is a whole new skill that you're developing, especially if you're just starting to learn to paint and starting with watercolor. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, I have clean water in my container. I'm going to close the curtain because it's creating a weird shadow there. Open up this one over here. That's enough light. Yes, it's perfect. All right, so I'm going to start by shading one with gray so that you can see what that looks like. And then I'll go back to the analogous and the complementary. So let's just say that I want this sphere to be blue. I'm going to clean out a section of my palette here. let me know if you have any questions, okay? I'm gonna be moving through these a lot faster, so I wanna make sure that I answer all of your questions before I leave. And don't feel like your questions have to be only or exclusively on this. And you can ask me, feel free to ask me anything art related, and I'd be happy to help you out if I can. I'm always happy to share what I know. If I can make your process easier in any way, I'm happy to do so. Okay, so this is Payne's Gray right here, and this is Prussian Blue. So I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's Gray into the Prussian Blue as I go and start developing my darker values. So I'm starting with plain Prussian Blue, tea consistency, making sure that I don't take any of that blue that has the gray seeping into it. I want plain Prussian Blue in the beginning. I go over everything with a light blue. Okay, making my way around the highlight, going over everything multiple times. Dipping my brush in my container. There we go. Okay, so a nice even sheen. No puddles anywhere. I'm going to start by adding more Prussian Blue into the mix and going in with more of a coffee consistency Prussian Blue, visualizing the terminator line and painting like a crescent moon shape along the terminator line. Maybe even bringing in a little bit of this second blue into this central light section, just because I know that after painting the darker band, I will want to go back to the central light section to add in more paint there. So I'm going to allow the paint to flow into the central light section this time from the beginning, and just allow the paint to do its thing as much as possible. Try not to overblend. Okay, ready. So now I'm going to take some Prussian Blue with a little bit of the Payne's Gray added in. Just a bit, not too much. You can test your color if you need to. But once again, visualizing the terminator and the band. My paper is very, very wet right now, by the way. I don't have a lot of control because my paper is so wet. So whenever I'm in that situation where I try to paint in a shape and it's moving too much, sometimes what's best is to just sit for maybe even up to a minute, depending on how wet the paper is. And then, yes, you want to make sure that the paper is still wet, but not as wet. And sometimes it's good to just wait for a moment and then try again. And yeah, just allow the paint to settle a little bit longer so that you don't have as much movement. But here you can see how much darker I was able to get with the gray. And by going with a gray instead of, say, a purple, which is analogous to blue, or you know, a green. If I go with a green or a purple, I won't be able to darken or lighten as much, especially with the colors that I have on my palette. If I had a very light purple, then perhaps I can use that light purple as my lighter color that I mix into my blue. But I don't have a very light purple right now. I have a very dark purple. So that analogous scheme or method is just not going to work for me. I need to work with the colors that I have. So what I was mentioning before is that grays work very well when you're trying to keep the color true to that color and you're not wanting to change it. Reaching for a gray is going to help you keep the color cleaner, more like that color, instead of reaching for an analogous color or a complementary, which is going to change the color because you're combining two. Just doing a little bit more sculpting here. And if you need to pull up the reflected light with your brush, you can go ahead and do that. Cleaning up edges. And just go for it. Sculpt while the paper is still wet. All right, I'm just gonna do a little bit of cleanup work. Lifting some paint off the reflected light section. And I'm gonna leave this alone. One of the hardest things to learn as well when you're painting with watercolor is learning to leave things alone. It's very hard. It's very hard, but you get better at it as you go. Okay. I'm gonna move on to the next one. And for this one, I'm gonna go with another set of complementary colors. I don't really have an orange right now on my palette. I mean, I have warm yellows, but these aren't orange. So I'm not really going to be able to achieve the, see, if I use this as an orange, as a complementary orange to blue, I'm gonna get a green. This is not really orange. It's a warm yellow. And I don't want my sphere to look green. So I'm gonna use another set of complementaries. I'm gonna use now, instead of a cool red and a cool green, I'm gonna use a warm red and a warm green and see what happens. They're still complementary colors. They're just warm instead of cool. So for, this is like a cadmium red or scarlet color. It's a very warm red. And then for my warm green, I'm going to use Undersea Green from Daniel Smith, okay? Red is definitely the lighter color of the two, and I want my sphere to look red. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my lighter color, tea consistency. Go over everything multiple times. And once you see that even sheen, use your first color in a thicker consistency. Red, making sure I'm using the same red and not another one. Painting this color into the entire shadow section. Trying to leave lighter values around the highlight. Around the highlight, I want lighter values. And then once I have this, I can start adding a little bit of green into the red to darken it, not too much. And I visualize the terminator line, paint in my color there. I want to work on my halftones a little bit more. So I'm going to go back to my plain red. And continue doing your sculpting. Darken the red if you need to with more green. If you do have an orange, by the way, on your palette, it's not a color I usually have, but if you do have an orange, I would recommend trying an orange sphere and use blue as your complementary. Cleaning up edges. Okay, now I need to darken that, darken the core shadow a little bit more because now I can't see it very much. Need to push the contrast. Notice how it looks like a brownish color. Can you hear my chicken? Let me know if you can hear her. She's been good this time. She didn't go crazy like she did last time. Okay, I'm gonna leave things alone. I think this one can definitely benefit from some glazing, but it's still damp. I would not go in and do any work on this one right now. Okay. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and add my cast shadow on this last study before I start making other puddles of colors and cleaning this one out. I was using burnt sienna. And then painting in the cast shadow. What colors don't I have? Maybe I'll do a yellow to orange one, perhaps. Yellow to red sphere. All right, and then for my scrubbing, tell us which orange is a true orange color. You'll usually see the word orange in the name. Mary, I can give you examples in just a moment. Give me one sec. There it is. Okay, so there's the sphere finished. These are all finished. So I'm gonna switch my sheet. Give me one sec, Mary. I don't ever, orange is one of those colors that I never buy. I never have in my palette. But if you go, for example, into Daniel Smith watercolor paints, or so many times I have gone into their site and I have, give me one sec. Color charts. For example, there is Pyrrole Orange, is an orange that you could use in combination with blue to create a brownish color. This red right here that I have that I almost never use is called Mayan Orange, but to me it's red. So, sometimes the names of different colors can be a little bit confusing. But if I were using an orange as a complementary to blue, I would make sure that it is like an actual orange. Permanent orange, cadmium orange hue, and the absolute best way to know for sure if the orange is an actual orange that will work with the blue is to mix it yourself and swatch out the mixture. Okay. Yeah, that happens, Mary. The absolute best thing that you can do is just mix it and swatch it out, because you're really never going to know unless you actually do the mixing yourself and swatch it out on paper. And that is why it's so important to do that before actually committing to using that color in a full painting, because you won't be able to erase it. Okay, so let's see. Yes, Valerie, this is live. This is live, but the replay will be up for you to enjoy whenever you would like. Okay. So, yeah. I'm just going to do these two last ones with maybe an analogous, I think, a couple of different analogous colors. I haven't done a yellow sphere. So I think I'll do a yellow to orange or yellow to red, something like that. Wherever you are at and whatever so far has happened in your practice, just choose what you want to practice more, okay? And go with that. You don't have to do exactly what I am doing. You have to go by what is happening in your own practice, okay? Okay. So I'm going to do cool yellow, and my cool yellow is going to turn into maybe this. See, the thing is, one of these is Hansa Yellow Light and the other is New Gamboge. Both of these are warm yellows. They're not really orange. You could say that this is like a yellow orange, like a you could say it's a tertiary color, but it's not an orange, okay? And because both of these are light colors, I won't really be able to develop like a good value range for depth. So I would have to bring in a red. Like there is no other way about it. If I want to go from yellow to red and I want, like it's either green and I make it turn green, or red and it looks more like a red orange. So I have to I need to bring in a red. So I'm just going to go with this warmer red that I used in my previous sphere. And now this is going to look orange. And now by bringing in this red, I'm going to be able to develop a nice value range, because red is definitely a darker color. I wouldn't say red is as dark as blue or purple. Definitely not. But it'll allow for a nice range of values, So I'm going to start with plain yellow. Make sure that I start with plain yellow. Otherwise, my sphere is not going to look very yellow at all. It's going to look more like an orange sphere. Let's see. Yes, I'm in agreement with it. One orange do like is burnt orange, but if it has added pigment curl. Yes. Yeah, I actually have quinacridone burnt orange on my palette. It's this one right here, and I love it. Oftentimes, I use it interchangeably with my burnt sienna when I am painting full pieces. And definitely for sure, if you add in quinacridone burnt orange or burnt sienna into the blue, you're going to start muting the blue, and it's a beautiful way to create dark colors and grays. One of my favorite gray recipes when I'm painting with watercolor is blue and brown. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, ultramarine blue and burnt umber, ultramarine blue and sepia. If you mix 50 of those two colors together, you get a beautiful, vibrant gray. And you can definitely, like, if you have more blue than brown in your mixture, you're going to get a darker blue. If you have more brown than blue in your mixture, you're going to get a darker brown. So it's a very versatile color combo. However, quinacridone burnt orange and burnt sienna are already neutrals. They're more like browns. And so I see those colors more like neutrals than like a pure color that would be in the outer edge of the wheel. See, in the color wheel, the purest forms of each color or hue are around the wheel. And in the center, you start getting into your browns and grays, because in the center is where all of these start coming together and getting intermixed. And remember that all of the colors in the color wheel are created by combining two primaries. Their primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. And with those three colors, you can make all of the colors in the wheel. And if you mix the three primaries, you're going to get a brown or a gray, depending on whether your primaries are warm or cool, okay? But in the center is where you're starting to mix colors together, and they're starting to become more and more neutralized. So when I am choosing complementaries and analogous colors, I try to go by colors that are in their purest form in the outer part of the wheel. And when I am using things like quinacridone burnt orange or raw or burnt sienna, burnt umber, and so on, or grays, I consider those as being combinations of the three primaries, not pure colors. I have a full color theory for beginners video on my channel. I shared it, I think, like last month or at most 2 months ago. So you should be able to find it relatively easily if you go into my video library in my channel, and over on Patreon you have it as well. I would highly recommend checking that out, because understanding the color wheel is so important. I cannot even begin to explain. It will help you with your color mixing so much. You'll understand color relationships, and you won't have to guess anymore if you understand color theory. When people skip over learning color theory, things just continue not making sense completely. Like you cannot completely make sense out of certain things, and you're always going to continue depending on people telling you exactly what colors to reach for. Whereas if you understand the color wheel and color theory, you're very easily able to substitute paint colors. When you see an artist using a specific color and you don't have that paint color, you want to substitute it for something else, you know what to switch it for easily. And you can foresee what's going to happen if you mix two colors together and avoid creating muddy colors and so on and so forth. So color theory is an art fundamental, just like light behavior is, which we talked about in the beginning of this lesson. Art fundamentals need to be covered. Otherwise, you're going to continue struggling, and things are not going to fully make sense. And you're going to continue just hitting walls. Okay. All right. So I have my first layer in. I'm gonna add a little bit of red into the mix. I think that's okay. And then I'm going to visualize the terminator line and paint in my shadow side. Gonna add a little bit more red, a little bit more yellow into the mix. And I'm gonna visualize that terminator line. Pop it in here. Need a little bit more yellow. I'm gonna work more on my light side and sculpt. I need to be careful. This is one of those situations where my entire sphere can start turning orange, more of a red-orange very easily if I am not super careful. I need to continue rinsing out my brush, making sure that I'm not bringing too much red into my color mixtures. Especially not in the light side. Maybe push, no, that is a ton of red. That is so much red. Oh my God. No, I need more yellow. A little bit more. Okay. There it is. I'm gonna leave it alone. And I'm gonna move on to my very last sphere, and then I'll quickly paint in the cast shadows in all of these and soften whatever I need to soften. And I'll show you very quickly how to do the glazing as well. Okay, so let's just say that for this one, I want, what do I want? Cool red to purple, maybe? Haven't done that. Red to purple is what I'm gonna do for this one. Red and purple are next to each other in the color wheel. We have red, then red, purple, then purple. So I could do, why not do this carmine color? Carmine is a cool red, like alizarin crimson. Carmine looks like this. And I'm gonna go back to my carbazole violet, this intense purple, and I'm gonna mix these two together, okay? And I want my sphere to look like a cool red. So I'm gonna go with carmine and make sure to start with a watered down, just taking a little bit of color from the edge of my puddle and start painting that in. I like wiggling my brush when I'm first going in and trying to cover a larger area, because pressing down the bristles of your brush and wiggling it can help you cover up sections faster. Just be careful not to go over the edge or paint past the edge. So this is my first color, going over everything a few times. I live in a very warm, dry environment, so I do find that using the pre-wetting technique and taking my time with this first layer, if I'm going in wet on dry, is very, very helpful for me. All right, once I'm ready, I'm first gonna go in with plain carmine, but a thicker consistency this time, more of a coffee consistency. Gonna visualize the terminator line and make sure that not too much paint is going into the central light section. And then once I have that in, I can start creating a mix of carmine and carbazole violet. Not too contrasting, not super dark. And don't go in too watery at this point because remember, now we're getting into the darker values. So you don't want to go in super watery. Visualizing the terminator line or the core shadow shape and painting that in right there. So as you move forward with your practice, I hope that you're using reference photos, okay? Because if you're not using reference photos, how are you going to develop your observational skills? I mean, it's all fine and good. Working from imagination, it's fine. But you develop your observational skills by having something to look at, and you understand things like light, color, perspective, even by observing what things look like in real life, okay? And of course, you can do exercises from imagination if you want to strengthen that skill to work from imagination, of course. But if you want to build up like the skills to draw or paint something in a believable way, I really believe that stemming from reference photos and spending time practicing with reference photos and understanding these key things is essential, especially if you're going for, again, mid to higher levels of realism, okay? But as you move forward with your practice and you do observe and practice your observation, try to find the highlights and the core shadows and the cast shadows and the occlusion shadows and the halftones, okay? Try to find them. And it's not going to always be that easy to find them, okay? I'm going to paint in the shadows in these because, as I mentioned in the beginning of this lesson, light is a complex thing. And every single situation, every single light situation is going to be different. Sometimes you're going to have multiple light sources. Other times you're going to have exterior scenes where you, like, it's a very cloudy day and it's a diffused light situation and you can't really tell very clearly even where the location of the light source is in relation to the buildings or the cars or whatever it is. You will be running into those kinds of situations, okay? But the important thing is that you make decisions as an artist. Sometimes it's not just about copying the references as they are, it's about pairing the visual information that you're taking from your references or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life with your understanding of light and form and perspective and all these things. And oftentimes, you have to make artistic choices. If you can't see a light source, then decide where it's going to be and make sure that you keep the lighting consistent throughout the scene. If you can't tell something, if you can't tell, anything, like if perspective is a little bit wacky in the photo, then decide if it's 1, 2, 3 point perspective and make sure that the entire scene has that perspective. Like, it is not just about copying the reference photos as they are. It's always pairing what you see with your understanding of fundamentals and making decisions that you think are going to help create a better looking composition, okay? Okay, so for this one, I use my warm red and my warm green. Warm green. And after this, all that is left is just explaining how to do a little bit of glazing. I'm just going to do it in a couple of these. And glazing is essentially when you layer watercolor, but the difference between layering and glazing is that I'm going to do a little bit of lifting here. The difference between layering and glazing is that layering can be done, like glazing is a type of layering, but not all layering is glazing, because sometimes when you layer, you're layering on thick paint. And when you do glazing, it's more watered down consistencies, more like coffee or even tea. Okay. So you're not covering, you're trying to leave the values and the paint, the color that you've created underneath, at least somewhat visible through that next layer of paint. And so I'm going to show you how I would increase the contrast in a couple of these by doing a little bit of glazing. Glazing can be used in combination with any of these techniques. Okay, you can do glazing with monochromatic, you can do glazing with neutrals, you can do glazing with complementary, you can do glazing with analogous. Let me do a little bit of softening here. Let me know if you have any last questions, because we're about to finish our lesson. This last sphere is still pretty wet, so if I go in and paint the shadow right now, it's gonna bleed. I wanted to, this is a little bit too, like the shape of this is a little bit strange, so I'm just gonna go in and kind of fix that a little bit, or see if I can fix it with scrubbing. Soften. I think it's a little bit better. Okay. All right, so where can I do some glazing? Maybe in this green one. Let me set this aside for now. All right. I'm gonna change my water one last time because it's very murky. Yeah, for glazing, you want to make sure that you're using clean water. Otherwise, you can muddy up your colors. Oh, yes. Titian red. I've definitely used that before. I have some Titian red in my White Nights watercolor set, which I use from time to time. And yeah, that's definitely, it has that red name to it, but it's definitely more orange. It's like a brick color. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm glad that you tested that out and that it works. Okay. So let me make some space here for my green, because I need some undersea green for this one. Let's just say that I want to push the values in this one a little bit more. Maybe even clean up a little bit of texture there. So because I'm looking to push the darker values, I'm going to go back to the last color that I was using for that one, right? Which was the undersea green. I don't need the yellow because I'm looking to push darker values. So for glazing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with like a coffee consistency, I would say. And then I'm just going to paint in that section, or a shadow shape. It's a little bit too watery. I need more green because I can barely see this. And I'm going to paint in that kind of the core shadow shape next to the terminator line. Remember, these are abstract irregular shapes. And once I have painted in that shape, I remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and I soften edge. Soften the edge. Soften the edge. Making sure that not too much of that paint got into the reflected light area. And if you want to push that centralmost section within the core shadow a little bit more, you can drop in a little bit more of your green while that initial layer is still wet. Here I need to soften again. Remember that the paint is always going to continue expanding and moving if the paper is wet. So sometimes things look a certain way, then you look away and you you come back to your painting and all of a sudden you see a sharp edge or something like that. Okay? It's normal because the paint is moving around. There you go. So that is how you do glazing. You only layer over that section where you're looking to darken, where you're looking to slightly change the color temperature, and so on and so forth. And you can see how much I increase the contrast. Now, this is going to lighten as it dries, but if I wanted to develop a bit of a lighter value here, because maybe the transition is a little bit too stark, you can still glaze a little bit in this central light section if you want to soften that transition. But be very, very careful because this section has not completely dried. So I'm being very careful not to go in with too much water and paint. You can start disturbing the paint which is drying and then you get splotches. So yeah, you have to do it very carefully. But that is essentially what glazing is. Now, let me do the same thing for this one over here. I think it can help me fix this section, which as you can see, this section looks a little bit like light or splotchy even. And maybe a little bit of glazing can help me fix that. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back to these colors. I was using my yes, I was using my cool red and my cool green for that one. So I'm going to make sure to go back to those colors that I was using. And maybe it's helpful to actually write down the name of the color that you used. Valerie, good night. Have a wonderful Sunday. Thank you for popping in. It's helpful to write down the colors that you're using so that you don't forget what you were using. So cool red, and then cool green. This is too much green. I need more red. If you want to test out your colors, you want to use the last color that you were using before. And then if you want to go darker over that, then you can do it over that color, okay? Kind of a coffee consistency. And I'm going to paint in my core shadow shape right here. Rinse out my brush, remove that excess water, and soften the edge by running my brush over the edge. Up here and down here because I want a soft transition on both sides. Don't want to overly darken anything else, so I need to be careful. And make sure that you have enough paint there, because if you go into watery, you can start creating backruns. The backrun is when too much water starts coming down the bristles of your brush, pushes out the paint that is drying, and it creates this splotch. So you're essentially going in with more water in your brush than what is on your paper. And that disturbs that paint that is starting to settle on your paper, creating a splotch. I don't know what that is, but if you want to work on your midtones a little bit more, then make sure to go back to using almost all alizarin or whatever your first color was. Yeah, complementaries are always going to be harder because of how different those colors are, right? And how much you can darken accidentally. And then, see, right now I found the need to kind of go in and do more work because all of a sudden things were looking too dark. Okay. So I probably went in way too dark just now. Lifting up some color off the reflected light and going in to push the core shadow one last time. Okay, any last questions, you guys? I hope this lesson was super helpful. I hope that you're taking lots of information with you that will help you succeed with future pieces, whether it's watercolor or something else that you enjoy using. I'm going to leave it alone. If I continue working, I'm just going to make it worse. This was probably my worst one. But again, this is a complimentary one that I did. So goes to show that the complimentary one is the hardest one. I'm gonna finish this last one and see if I have any last questions. For this one, I was using my cool red and my purple. Thank you to everyone on Patreon who chose this month's live class topic. It's Patreon members who choose the topics for each lesson, the live lessons that I teach. They choose it off a poll that I send out earlier in the week. And some gentle scrubbing at the top. And there it is. All right. Let me pop myself back on screen again. Alrighty, so that is it for today's live class. I really hope that this one was helpful for you guys who are starting with watercolor, or maybe you're specifically having trouble with the shading aspect of watercolor. It's definitely a very extensive topic, but I hope that I was able to provide lots of information that you can take with you to be kind of to make your next painting process a little bit more streamlined and less confusing, which is always important to think about how you're going to be tackling things before actually jumping into the painting process, especially with watercolor, because you can't really fix mistakes as easily as you can with other painting mediums. Thank you so very much to everyone who joined in. Thank you, Patreon members, for being part of my innermost community. My Patreon is essentially my little online art school where I teach my most in-depth lessons and workshops, and I share more than what I share on social media or even on YouTube because I feel safer there. So thank you so much to everyone who joined in. I wish you a wonderful, wonderful rest of your weekend, and also a lot of enjoyment and progress as you move forward in your painting journeys and your journey with art in general. Uh, Thank you. Yes, patience is so important. I agree. Art has definitely taught me mindfulness and patience and persistence as well, which are, I think, mm, a set of skills that a lot of people kind of lack nowadays. And it's one of the reasons why learning something like art and having an art practice can bring so much to your life, not only in terms of you as an artist, but also you see how these like personal skills positively affect other areas of your life. And that is a beautiful thing. I'm so happy that this one was helpful. Bluebird, it was nice to see you here. My throat is getting parched from so much talking. Actually, my throat got parched a while back. I haven't even finished my cup of coffee, if you can believe that. Anyway, thank you so much, you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Enjoy your art practice and hope to see you very soon for another tutorial, another live class, chats over on Patreon, social media. Make sure to follow me over on Instagram because I'm constantly sharing helpful tips, motivation clips, and things that are coming up over there as well. And yeah, that is it for today. Thank you, Mary. I'm so happy that you learned a lot. And yes, I hope to see you guys around. Reach out whenever you'd like. I always love helping people out. And thanks so much. Bye, everyone.